for the taking. If you'd like to have a copy. Now, tomorrow, following Faith for Living, at 10:30, we have Religious Life Seminar in joint seminar with the Education Pillar. And it will be A Front Porch for All People by John Edgar. His book is over at the Fine Print, and he'll be having a 2-day seminar on the Front Porch for All People, talking about how a free store and a food pantry grew into a congregation that transformed the life of a community in the south side of Columbus and made a huge difference there. And I believe this will be inspirational for all of us. And then I want to remind you, too, that we have several seminars coming up. Take a look at this. In 2 weeks, Dan Moulton will be talking about two folks who changed the course of Christian history through their translations of the Bible, the story of Jerome and the story of William Tyndale. That'll be Monday, July 22nd and July 24th at the train station. And then something we have not done before, and that is to have a healing art poem making seminar with John Fox, who comes to us from Palo Alto, California. And this is the only time that you need to actually sign up ahead of time. Registration will be restricted to 18 people, and you need to go on the Lakeside website and register for that seminar if you want to be part of it. And that will be Wednesday, July 31st and Thursday, August 1st. And so in Lakeside Hall. And so I remind you about that. And there is a fee for that. Again, it's the only time we're charging for something. There's a $50 fee for that seminar. We are delighted this week to have the Reverend Grace Imathau with us from First United Methodist Church in Evanston, Illinois. She is a native of Kenya, where she has been for the past 3 weeks visiting her family. And we're so happy to have her here with us this week. All I will say, because I don't want to take more of her time, is that she has been to Lakeside on 2 other occasions and, of course, was very well received in 2011 and 2013. And her book, Words of Fire, Spirit of Grace, is for sale in the lobby following. It's $20, and it's 12 sermons from Grace here. So if you didn't get enough yesterday, and who of us did, there's 12 more in this book, and you can pick one of those up on your way out this morning. And they're being handled by Melissa Lindsay, a friend of the Imathau family, who recently graduated from Connecticut College with a degree in sociology. And so without further ado, would you welcome Grace Imathau?
What a joy it is to be back in Lakeside, and thank you so much for being here this morning. I was mentioning to some of the friends in the room that when I get excited, my English goes so fast, so you are allowed to be my speed bumps. If I go fast and you do something like this, I'll take that to be a speed bump, and I'm quite okay with you signaling for me to speak slower, because the Kimeru language, which is my first language, is a very fast language, and the faster you speak it, the more fluent you're considered. So sometimes my tongue does get out of control. So I'm quite comfortable with you being my speed bump on that. I will not take offense on that. It's been so good being back again on this side of the big pond. I spent the 3 weeks with my mom and dad. My mom is now 89 and my dad is 93, and we have to keep reminding him he is 93 in his head and in how he does his life. He thinks he's 50. So we just have to keep reminding him, Dad, you've got to slow down a little bit. And tomorrow I hope to have some of the slides or some of the pictures that I took of home. One of the things I was so surprised when I went home and for 3 weeks started taking a walk every morning, 5 miles around the places I grew up in, was how surprised I was that there were no birds. I remember And sometimes I know it's very nostalgic when you start thinking of your childhood. It's probably not quite as exciting as one's memory is. But I remember how many birds there were. And just especially these little tiny birds we call gachinchigiri. There were just tons and tons of those birds everywhere. But this time, there were hardly any birds. I married a man up from the Arctic Circle, and when he came to visit, the one thing he was so surprised 30 years ago when we got married was the number of birds. And being a photographer, he came back and took pictures of birds. He spent his time just taking pictures of birds. And so this time there were no birds, or there were so few birds that I could say there were no birds. And I decided, as I took these walks, my father has given me half an acre of land, of his land, that one of the things I want to do beginning next year is actually turning that piece of land, instead of building a huge McMansion like everybody is. My sister's built her huge McMansion with her swimming pool. I'm going to turn that into a bird sanctuary where I'm going to just plant trees and millet and mangana, you know, the old plants around there. And I'm going to do that for my great-grandchildren, not for myself. I'm going to just have that land be just a little tiny forest. And I keep telling Melissa, I want the birds in the air to be flying and saying, I wonder where I can get a place to perch tonight. And they'll be saying, try Grace's place. You know, I want it to be known by the birds of the air, Grace's place, you know. So I came back, and as I flew, I started getting more and more excited about the birds in the air just saying, yeah, you know, just go 7 flights on the right and turn and make a left and a quick turn, and you can't miss it. There's always millet there. There's always, you know, trees there. There's a sanctuary there. That somehow I want, even if it's such a tiny effort, I want those who read the story of the world to say, the climate change, the world was changing so fast, and she could not stop it, but at least she made an effort. I want to actually be that person. So I came back feeling quite excited, and I'm talking Melissa's ear off about this bird sanctuary that is already growing in my mind and in my heart. I'm thinking of people like in my church where I pastor in Evanston. I'm thinking of Judith, whose backyard she has decided to turn into a place where pollinators can have a stop. And I know there are people in the room who are doing their 10 cents worth, a penny worth, of doing something about this world that God dreamt and that we can dream together with our world. So I come back excited and having another vision of how to be a good steward in this world. My husband David, who's a photographer, and he was a wonderful photographer. And in our book, the book that he edited of sermons, he said, you know, the front cover is going to be a photograph of a sermon. And I thought I knew exactly what was going to be. It was obviously going to be me preaching, you know, at my best, and, you know, something like that or something like that. And so whenever he was around with a camera, I always tried to pose, you know, or maybe hurling at a pot, you know, some sort of sermon-y looking thing. And David had not grown up in the church. He was as European as they come, with his green eyes, and just an amazing person, but also an atheist. And so he had always been very suspicious of Christians and of the church and of sermons. And he heard me preach. He was walking by and he was curious about this African person preaching, and he was curious because I am a struggler. By the grace of God, I have more questions than answers. And I believe the way to God is through questions. And in fact, the more I'm struggling and the more doubts I have, the more I know I'm closer to God. So, and the more sure I am, the more suspicious I am of myself. So he was curious about that kind of a struggling faith that calls itself faith. And so he was good for me. He was very good for me with asking questions, with pushing me. I grew up in a more fundamentalist, more conservative Christian theology. On that, it was very important to have the day that you were born again, that you were saved. And my memory is that I kept forgetting the day I was saved. So whenever there was a big revival, I would go and get saved again and write down the date so that I could remember the day I gave my life to Christ. And then soon enough, I would forget. And so I would wait for the next revival and write it down. And I remember I had been saved like 9 times when I was getting up, and my mother grabbed my dress and told me, "Sit down, you've already been oversaved. You're good to go. You're good to go," on that. So I grew up with that kind of anxiety about, will God be upset if I don't remember the date, my birthday in the Christian, in the spirit. And to come to know a God who is bigger than any of that. The God who loved me in the Methodist theology, prevenient grace. The God who was there and loved me even before. Psalm 139, before you were born, I knew you in your mother's womb. So to come to love that God who does that, that God who loves us all completely. So David was going to take a picture of this sermon, and for months he was looking for the right sermon. He was studying to see, how is it that I work on a sermon. I'm a slow person, so my sermons take about maybe a couple of months before I get a sermon right. That explains why they are long in that. So he finally said, I got it. And he took a picture of the sermon. And I was, of course, very curious to see how a photograph of a sermon looks like. And he said he was up north. The home we have up north is 45 miles north of the Arctic Circle in a little town called Porjus, Porjus, in Sweden. And he said he had been caught in a rainfall, and he was standing under a fir tree and a pine tree. And as he was standing there, he was a person who paid attention. That was his superpower, paying attention. And he was paying attention to the water, to the rain as it fell on this pine needle. And he kept watching it, and the water kept filling until a point when it then dropped onto the ground. And for some reason, he saw that and he said, that's a sermon. You just keep reflecting, you keep reading, you keep doing your research, your exegetical work, until it fills and it is ready, and then it drops down to the ground where it waters the ground. That is a photograph of a sermon. And so he took all these photographs of the drop of water until he found the perfect one. And that is, if you see that cover, that's what that photograph is, and it's the photograph of a sermon. I told him, I said, I try not to look disappointed because I really do think my would have been better, but I try not to look disappointed, and I said, nobody will know what in the world this is, that this is a photograph of a sermon. He said, those who need to know will know. And so if you needed to know, there I have told you what that is, a photograph of a sermon. And maybe that's also the photograph of our own faith on that journey. This morning, I want to speak about a passage, and I want to come to the passage in different places. And in order to do that, I'm going to read the passage. I'm going to tell you about the image on the ground, on the screen, so that can be helpful in informing what I'm doing. And then I'm going to get into the passage. So 3 things: I'll read the passage, I'll inform you about about that image, and then I'll enter more into the passage. The passage I want to work with is on Genesis chapter 45. And it's only 2 verses. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And Joseph wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. The passage I really want to work is on that verse 2. And Joseph wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Thanks be to God. Amen. The image we have is those of us who are fans of The Crown. Anyone fan of The Crown? Yes. Fan of The Crown Netflix series. This is in season 1, episode 2. And that's the only episode I've watched. And let me also confess, I have just watched this scene over and over again. This is the scene where Princess Elizabeth, she is 25 years old, is going to represent her father, King George, in the Commonwealth, and she's traveling to Kenya on his behalf. What the princess doesn't know is in this trip, her father will die, and she will become queen in Kenya. In this scene, it's before we see her, we hear the plane, and as we listen, we see Kenya from the plane, 8,000 feet or so from above. The princess has not spoken yet. When you see this scene and see Kenya, what you might not know is further to the left is the Rift Valley, which runs all the way, connecting up to the Middle East. You would not have seen that. What you would not have known is further then, you will find Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria, where you will find the source of the Nile. What you might not know is right by Lake Victoria, and this is in 1952, this scene, on this day that it's being filmed, there is a high school on this particular day of this scene, there is a high school by Lake Victoria, Maseno High School, and there is an 18-year-old boy in that school in 1952. And that boy in 1960 will be coming to the United States to study at the university in Hawaii. And that boy, his name is Obama, is going to be the father of the President of the United States. This Princess Elizabeth doesn't know that. That if only we could see further into our story. She doesn't know right there. She will be actually meeting with that son in Buckingham Palace, who will be President of the United States. Who the thunk? She doesn't know as she looks down from that 8,000 foot high, she doesn't know if she looked closer, she would see there is a forest right by Mount Kenya. In that forest already, there are people, Kenyans, organizing themselves, and their leader is a man named Jomo Kenyatta. She doesn't realize that in just 6 years, she will be returning to Kenya and handing over Kenya to this president of Kenya. She doesn't know that. She doesn't know that right on this scene, when you look down, there is a 20-year-old who is doing correspondence work, and he is going to be the president of the World Methodist, and his daughter is going to be standing at Lakeside in 2024. The story, what I'm trying to get at is sometimes when you look down and the narrator insists there is only one story you need to know, but there are so many stories going on. What she doesn't know is right on that scene in Nairobi, where this plane is going to land, at the Pumwani Hospital, there is an Indian family who have immigrated to Kenya from India in order to work for the British Empire as clerks. And they are having a baby in Pumwani Hospital. And that baby's baby is going to be the Prime Minister, the first Indian Prime Minister of England. It is amazing to me that I had to pause on this before the narrator messes up the complicated story. Because you see, the narrator is going to do what narrators do, which is insist there is only one narrative that you need to know, that only one narrative matters, that only the story of the princess matters. But when you know there is more than one story. And perhaps to be a person of faith is to live in the tension of many stories. And even in our own life, that we know we are not just one story, that we live in the tension of being more than one story. I kept watching this, and if you come too often to my house, you'll discover that on the television is this one scene that is frozen, to remind me there is indeed the princess's story, and the princess is going to become queen. She does not realize she will become queen in Kenya. Tomorrow, I was born in the mountains, and I want to tell you another story of how I traveled to the lakeside, to Lake Victoria in 2020, and the surprise of discovering there a small, tiny community, United Methodist community, so dirt poor that they did not have water. It is one member of the congregation I serve in Evanston who just stood up and said, I feel moved to dig a well, and sent $60,000 to dig a well for them. And that community, they had invited me there to lead their charge conference. The Bishop Wandabula had given me permission to preside over their church conference. And they wanted to ask one question. We would like to be a reconciling congregation. And I thought, this is not going to happen. Mud hut of a church. These people do not have clean water. They want to be a reconciling congregation. Do they know that's... But I was asked to preside, and I brought that proposal. And oh, I can't wait for you to see that picture. The whole congregation, yes. And they became the first reconciling congregation in Africa, the first reconciling congregation outside the United States. They became the match that lit the fire. And they said, of course we know human sexuality is diverse. One of them stood up and said, when it says God created Adam and Eve, it's like God is Alpha and Omega. Adam is one end of the spectrum, and Eve is on the other end of the spectrum, and everybody else in between. I hadn't heard that before. Like, there is diversity. Who would have thunk that I would have gone to a little mud hut of a church on that Lake Victoria? Sometimes when we are looking at the story from too high above, 8,000 feet, we think there's only one narrative, but the closer you come, the more complex it gets. May God give us eyes to see from our view, what is it in 100 years, in 200 years, that we wish we would have done, if nothing else, that we got along, we forgave each other, we spent more time listening to one another, being curious about each other, and maybe building a bird sanctuary that birds are saying, try Grace's place. If you're homeless as a bird, Grace's place. Maybe that's going to be whispered around on that. And so I want to then jump into Genesis 45. Genesis 45, which we have read. And Joseph wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. You know the story. Jacob starts with Jacob. Jacob, who wrestled with God all night until he dislocated his hip and walked with a limp. From that match, that was a draw. Jacob changed his name after that match to Israel. We're told Israel means struggle. And we read that in the Torah, the name Israel translates to struggle with God. And Jacob prevails in the struggle and is blessed with the name Israel, which can also mean one who perseveres with God. How comforting to know that one of the ways we love God is by struggling with God. How comforting to know that wrestling with God is a love language for God. How comforting to know, perhaps to quote Bickner, that doubt is actually another way of loving God. Well, this Jacob, who changed his name to Israel, had 12 sons, which is how we get the 12 tribes of Israel. Each son becomes a tribe. And the story goes that out of his 12 sons, Jacob loved his son Joseph the best. And Jacob gave Joseph a special coat. And the text itself says the coat was special because it had long sleeves, which was a sign of extravagance, but the more popular interpretation of many colors grabs the imagination. And we can't complain too much because the Technicolor coat has landed Joseph on Broadway. But anyway, Jacob's favoritism caused sibling rivalry. Favoritism that caused the brothers to hate Joseph. One day, the story goes, the brothers grabbed Joseph and they threw him in a pit. And then they had a change of plan. They decided to sell him into slavery in Egypt. And they took the special coat, they splashed it with goat's blood, and they took the bloodied coat to their daddy Jacob, who assumed his favorite son was dead. Now, this story is also in the Quran. And in the Quran, we are told that old man Jacob wept so much over his reportedly dead son that he became blind. And in the meantime, Joseph is sold into Egypt as a slave, and he is bought by a certain Mr. Potiphar. And Mr. Potiphar is like the head of the CIA in Egypt. And the story says Joseph, who is about 17 years old at that time, has a run-in with Mrs. Potiphar. To cut a long story short, it's a case of sexual harassment in the workplace. And Joseph runs, leaving his robe behind. And Mrs. Potiphar accuses Joseph of attempted rape. And innocent Joseph is thrown in prison. And it is in prison. It is in prison that Joseph unearths a gift. Joseph becomes known as an interpreter of dreams. So when Pharaoh has a disturbing dream, he calls Joseph to interpret the Pharaoh's dream. And Freud would have had a heyday with Pharaoh's dream. It's a dream of 7 ugly and thin cows eating 7 sleek and fat cows, and then 7 ears of grain which are thin and blighted, eating 7 ears of grain which are plump and good. And when Joseph interprets the Pharaoh's dream, Pharaoh is so pleased, he promotes Joseph to something like assistant to the Pharaoh. And Pharaoh removes his Pharaoh's ring and puts it on Joseph's finger. And Joseph is made into an honorary Egyptian. He is given an Egyptian name that is hyphenated and complicated and begins with the letter Z. He marries an Egyptian woman by the name of Asenath. They have 2 children. And 7 years later, there is a world famine as per the dream. And Joseph's brothers travel all the way from the land of the Hebrews, and they come to Egypt to buy food. And guess who is in charge of selling food? None other than Joseph. And it's been nearly 20 years, and the brothers do not recognize Joseph. How could they? Joseph now has an Egyptian name, an Egyptian wife, Egyptian children. He walks like an Egyptian. And although his brothers do not recognize him, Joseph recognizes them. And we are not told, we are told that Joseph does not immediately reveal his identity to his brothers. To skip over a good chunks of a great story, a time came when Joseph could no longer contain himself. And we are told he wept. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, that the household of Pharaoh heard him. And it is after the weeping, we are told, that Joseph says something so unexpected and so radical. After the weeping, he says to his brothers, "Come closer. I am Joseph. I am Joseph, your brother." That is the Joseph story from 8,000 feet. But up close, the Joseph story has many facets and angles. You can preach a sermon using this story and preach a sermon on forgiveness. After all, Joseph is the example par excellence of forgiveness. He forgives his brothers who had attempted to murder him and then sold him into slavery. Even in the final episode, the brothers are afraid and they say, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" And Joseph tells them, "Fear not. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good." And we are told he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. So surely the Joseph story is about forgiveness, is it not? The point being that anything and everything is forgivable. But light can strike the Joseph story in another way. The Joseph story is not about Joseph at all. It turns out that the Joseph story is actually a story about God. And this is so true. After all, God smuggles God's self in human stories. After all, God smuggled God's self in stories of biblical characters where we study biblical characters in order to understand God. This story is about God's self-revelation. This Joseph story is about the story of God, a God who is unstoppable. God cannot be stopped by desert. God cannot be stopped by misfortune. God cannot be stopped by slavery. God cannot be stopped. God is a God who brings life in places of barrenness and emptiness. Oh, listen up. The desert cannot stop God. We are talking about a God who makes Sarah burst into laughter with the promise of a child when her womb is a desert. We are talking about a God who blesses Joseph in the land of his misfortune. We are talking about a God who makes a bad situation a good situation, gives Joseph a powerful position, a loving wife, 2 beautiful sons, and overwhelmed by God's goodness, Joseph names one of his sons, "God has helped me forget my hardship." And the other son he names, "God has made me fruitful in a desert." So you see, the story of Joseph is really a testimony about God. A God who does not wait for conditions to be right in order to act, a God who acts anyway. God acts even under the most hostile of circumstances. The story of Joseph can also be read as a warning story about the danger of privilege. Joseph is a first child to his mother Rachel, and although Joseph is not his father's first or only child, his father treats him as though he's the first and only child. His father makes him a coat with long sleeves, which shows an extravagance and generosity, a waste of fabric in a large family of 5 wives, 12 sons, and numbered daughters. If Jacob's siblings shopped at Thrifty, Joseph's daddy took him shopping at exclusive stores. If Jacob's large family wore homespun clothes without a label, Joseph's daddy invented the first brand name, Joe. With such pampering, such special treatment, such preference, no wonder Joseph dreams of being a prince and a king, the boss of you all. One time Joseph has a dream, and the gall of it, he actually tells his brothers his dream. He tells them, I dreamt you all bowed down to me. And he tells them, I dreamt that the sun, the moon, the 11 stars were bowing down to him. Oh, I don't know about you, but I don't like him. This is such a privileged child that he actually imagines himself to be better than his brothers. Now, I want to tell you that my clock is going to go off at 9:57, and wherever I'm at, we'll just stop and I'll pick up tomorrow. But I want to quickly tell you the story, my own story of experiencing this privilege. When I went to first grade, my parents called me the week before school started, and they told us that there was going to be a missionary coming from a place called Scotland. They opened the big atlas and showed me where Scotland was. And Reverend Mackenzie had a daughter my age who was going to be in first grade too. And I was going to be assigned to look after her. Her name was Allison. And my job was to make sure that 7-year-old Allison would not be bullied and the school would not hurt her. That was my first job and paid job in first grade. And so we went off with Allison. She came, and everybody wanted to touch Allison's skin. They'd never seen someone with such skin, wanted to touch Allison's hair. But the interesting thing is that the week before Allison came, there was a new outhouse that was constructed. And that outhouse had a cement floor, unlike the outhouses we used, which were just a hole in the ground. And it had, unlike our iron sheets outhouses, hers was actually built of stone. And they actually had a path going to the outhouse, and flowers on the sides, and a big padlock. And I was in charge of the key. The key was tied with a string around my neck, and only Allison, not even I, could use that outhouse. We were so curious about that outhouse. And somebody was employed to clean the outhouse. Allison loved her outhouse. She went to the outhouse way too many times. Sometimes 3 times a morning she would need to go to the outhouse. And I accompanied her everywhere. For some reason, I resented her. When she went back to England, Scotland with her parents, it was only about 10, 15 years ago that I reconnected back with her. She now lives in Italy with her family and her grandchildren. And we FaceTime, and we've met once, and we exchanged stories. I was so surprised by the way she told her story. Apparently, she was so terrified. She was even afraid of me, that I might betray her. And she said she just realized she could not blend in no matter how hard she tried. She said she was so afraid that the only safe place she felt was in the outhouse. All this time we thought she went to the outhouse because she couldn't hold her water. It turned out that she went there to cry. I had never thought of that. I thought she looked so put together and so happy and pleased to be better than the rest of us. It turned out that her privilege also was hurting her. How could I have not known other stories were going on with her? Joseph. The story of Joseph also hurts him. And maybe he has to numb himself in order to survive. And we are told that there came a time when he could hold it no longer, and he wept. In his prophetic imagination, Walter Brueggemann writes about the prophetic work of breaking the numbness of self-deception and despair. And according to Brueggemann, pain and regret numbs God's people, and the covenant is frozen, and there is no possibility of newness under the numbness unless we weep. Brueggemann says that according to the tradition of biblical faith, anguish is the door to historical existence. The painful embrace of endings permits beginnings. And that's the one thing that I don't want to do. I would rather stay angry than weep. I would rather stay afraid than weep. I don't know about you, but I would rather continue being numb than weep. Anything but grieve. No wonder we consume more and more stories about them, whoever they are, about how ugly they are, how mean they are, how terrible they are, how immoral they are, to keep ourselves numb. Perhaps it is only by grieving, by weeping, that we got where we are, both as a people, as a nation, as a church. That it is only anguish and grieving that leads to joy and life. There is only weeping that permits new beginning. And so Joseph begins to weep. And we are told he wept so loudly. He does not care that the household of Pharaoh hears him. His boss hears him. He weeps so loud, he is so vulnerable. He does not care that the Egyptians hear him. And it is only after weeping, he then says to his brothers, I am Joseph. I am your brother. No longer I am your boss, I am the privileged one. No longer I am the one you bow to. I am your brother. I am Joseph, he says. I am your brother. And then he tells them, come closer. Come closer. That the distance between us may be closed. Come closer. I am your brother. I am Allison, your sister. Come closer. I am Grace, your sister. Come closer. And maybe we are where we are because we have not lamented. We've not lamented that the United States has the largest prison population in the world. We have not lamented that school shootings are not shocking anymore. In fact, some friend of mine said, We just simply wait for the next one. One poet says, crying out and weeping are great resources. A nursing mother, all she does is wait to hear her child. Just a beginning whimper, and she's there. God created the child that is your wanting, so that it might cry out, so that the milk might come. So cry out. Don't be stolid and silent with your pain. Lament, and let the milk of loving flow into you. Give your weakness to one who helps. Amen. There we are with a couple of minutes for conversation. Any questions, any response?
Is very profound what your insights to this story and the idea that pain and anguish without those tears, they kind of fester into evil. I really like that understanding, and I didn't know that before. But I wonder how you look at the world right now with so much animosity and difficulties with polarization and the feeling that there's no middle ground anywhere. There's no areas where we can look at each other across political lines and see brotherhood and sisterhood. And it's like each group hangs out with their own, watches the news that's reported to support only their own viewpoint. It seems like more and more God is not welcome in the public square, and we who are Christians are looked upon with derision and are accused of bigotry and whatever, simply because we believe the truth of the Bible, the truth that God reveals to us in that book of love. So how are you coping, living here amongst this very divided and very a world of animosity? No matter what you watch on TV or read, there's animosity hiding in it in some way.
Yeah, thank you. What would you hope I would be like?
You know, I don't want to be angry all the time. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm doing, which I don't know is right, is I'm avoiding the news. Mm-hmm. I don't really want to hear what one side says about the other. I just want to try to be what Jesus wants me to be with the people I'm around. Mm-hmm. Hopefully that's going to help, even though it's your bird sanctuary. Mm-hmm. It's tiny, and it's just my little piece of it, but it's all I can do.
Yeah. I have one of my best friends in Evanston is Rabbi Rachel, who is the rabbi at the synagogue. And after the October 7th events, I was so involved in the ceasefire, and I was
so angry, and I was learning more about the Palestinian plight. And I knocked at Rabbi Rachel's house, and I said, I just want to sit with you for half an hour. I don't want to talk. I just want to sit with you. And we sat on her couch. She lit a candle. She had no clue what it was about. And we sat together, and she reached out at some point and held my hand, and we sat there, held hands, half an hour, 45 minutes. I don't know why tears were flowing down my face, but they did, and hers too. And when we got done after that length of time, I got up, we hugged, and I left. We did not talk. I have a MAGA friend. Wow, I used the word friend. Thank you. I have a MAGA friend who, when things got so bad, I said, let's just sit. We went and sat by Lake Michigan for the longest time. We didn't talk. We just sat there together. When we got done, we got up and left. I just want to remember people are human beings. They're people who are afraid, and we all are. I have no answer. I'm just saying I have no answer. I know I was so surprised when someone at the airport asked me, we got chatting with this stranger, and they asked me what my work is. And for some reason, I just did not want to tell them I'm a pastor. I thought they would misunderstand who I was. The E word, evangelical, it's becoming very difficult being a person of faith. And I'm also grateful that it's this difficult, because it means less this and more how we live. Thank you for that question. And my answer is I have no clue. Yeah.
Thank you, Grace.
Asante, thank you.
Grace, you've given us a lot to think about this morning, and we sure appreciate it. Our time is out, and let's give Grace a hand for her work this morning. God bless you. Remember that her book is for sale in the lobby.